So here we are inside of an organization. And in a perfect world, when you send somebody to some type of training, you hope that that individual is going to come back to the organization and benefit the organization from that training. But sometimes that leadership training, it doesn't stick. And it's not because the content was wrong, it's not because the facilitator was bad. I've seen it 1,000 times to where I've had individuals come inside of my classroom, sit down for 2 weeks through 80 hours of training, and then go back to their organizations. They're never able to apply the training because there was never a reinforcement system. There were no support structures in the organization to help them to enable the training to improve organizational behavior. Because without a reinforcement system, the environment that they're going back into, it's going to cause them to continue to exhibit pre-existing behaviors. So interesting thing is when you leave the training session and you go back to the organization, you've got all these notes, you've got all these plans, you've got all these great intentions to improve the organization's environment. That's what you want to do, and everything that you learn is aligned with what the organization says we want leaders in an organization to be. But as soon as you sit down at your desk and you power up your computer and you open up your emails, you've got 4,000 emails. You got 4,000 emails and 15 taskers, and you're looking around and this you got this mess piled up on you. The last thing that you're thinking about is that training session you went to for the last 48 hours, because the business kept moving. That the bus kept traveling down the road, the train kept on rolling down the road. I remember I was a leader one time in Korea. I was a tank platoon sergeant, and I went on leave for 2 weeks, and I came back. I went into the motor pool, and prior to me going on leave, I had done a dress rehearsal on our surfaces for our tanks, which is an intense maintenance process. And so I go down onto the tank line. I go and I look at the tank line. I got two tanks down there, and they're set up the way they're going, supposed to be. And then I look at them, but there's nobody around my tank. So I crawl up on top of the tank. No one's there. I'm like, okay, what's going on? It's like 9 o'clock in the morning. So I go down into the maintenance bay and I look into the maintenance bay and I slam down on the fender because I didn't want to climb up inside of my tank. And I sit up there, two heads pop out, and it's two of my PFCs. And they go, finally, Sergeant Irby, you showed up. And I said, are we red until we're dead? And that means that everybody in my platoon has been tasked out by higher level commands. And I said, are you two the only two left? And they were like, yeah. And they were literally holding down services. That's what I'm talking about when we talk about training. Are you able to influence and inspire other individuals to continue on with the mission while you're gone? And so the business kept moving. However, even though I was depleted down to two PFCs, two private first classes, they were covering down until I got there, and then everybody else started trickling back into the platoon. Because without a structured system to hold those new behaviors accountable, the old behaviors manifest. Now, I would look at some other organizations and services would stop, but nothing can actually stop because the production and the services have to continue. That's why the business is there. You got to keep the business alive. So when I'm sitting there and I'm looking at these behavioral changes, like when I went into the motor pool, there's three criteria that I've always measured to confirm if the lesson stuck. One is the observable behavior change. I'm looking for measurable, repeatable actions that differ from pre-training. Those two PFCs, prior to training, they wouldn't have been able to cover down while everybody was absent. However, since they were trained and dress rehearsed on it, they were able to implement the process. So that meant there were improved consequences or either downstream results. We met all of our KPIs for services. We had fewer errors, we had better decision making, and they did it safely, which was absolutely outstanding for two private first classes to be able to do that. And so then we've got to be able to look at cognitive stability. The cognitive stability of those new behaviors implemented in those two individuals throughout their career, they continue to excel, and they took those lessons learned on into their new units. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about planting seeds of greatness inside of individuals. But in order to do that, you have to have a support system or a reinforcement system of this learning material. Those seeds of greatness are planted with the ABC attitude behavioral model. So when I sit there and I look at it, that's the missing layer, because the affect, which is the emotional reaction to the trainer that that leader went to, when you come back to your organization, bar in mind all the other distractions. If you're still able to implement that and you're able to cognitively process those beliefs that are aligned with the organization, we're talking about new training values, the relevance of the material, being able to inject it into the organizational environment, you're going to get behaviors and the willingness of other individuals who see you exhibiting these model behaviors, and they're going to be like, hey man, I'm on board. If Mr. Irby's on board, I'm on board with this. If my leader's on board with this, I'm on board with this. So here's the deeper truth. In a lot of organizations that I've seen, and I've got a lot of training experience, a lot of individuals leave the classroom with a negative attitude, or either their leaders have a negative attitude towards the training that they're sending their leaders to. And that negative affect is, this is pointless. I don't understand why we're doing this, because we're always going to do what we've always been doing. You now have a cognitive misalignment saying, this has nothing to do with my job. I don't need to learn any effective communication skills. I don't need to learn any of these soft skill stuff. But if you don't learn any of this stuff, that attitude, the things that you can't see that are below the waterline, those behaviors and those consequences that you don't want are going to continue to persist. So, how do we get this behavior change? And what is required for it to stick? Rinse and repeat. It's the continuous exposure of the application of the training until you start to see the consequences and the products and the services that are produced. You've got to learn to master the micro decisions. This is something that I teach my granddaughters. You may not like the process. I don't care if you like the process. Personally, me, I don't care if I like the process, but you're going to love the results. And that's the whole entire thing, because eventually you're going to get to new habits. That is what we want. If you're in the game and you just literally want the results, but you're not willing to work, then you just need to leave the game, because you're always going to be losing. And I know when I'm inside of an organization and I'm sitting there and I'm looking at individuals, I'm like, yeah, the job is hard. It wasn't meant to be easy. That's why you have the necessary competencies to be able to do it. I have to be able to positively influence these individuals' attitudes to where they start aligning their mood orientation to say, I'm going to actively engage in this. And over time, it's going to become easier. I'm going to become more proficient at it. I'm going to develop new skills. My behaviors are going to be more aligned with what the standard operating procedures are going to be. And I'm going to start producing products and services that meet the benchmarks that are required by the organization. And that is all influenced by leadership, because that's what your followers, your employees are looking for. They're looking at you saying, I need some influence, I need some guidance and some mentorship. Key thing, ABC attitude, when you start looking at the self, the intention, the intention behind the behavior, that's the reinforcement key. Because the training event itself, if you're investing into training and you don't have a reinforced architecture, the only thing you're doing is paying for a very expensive social experiment. That's all you're doing. And then eventually, if training isn't reinforced over time, individuals are going to forget what they learned, and then you're going to continue to do what you've always done. So to close this out, you got to ask yourself, what's the last leadership training that you've engaged in the last 90 days or better that stuck? Tell me in the comments below. We're engaged in phase 3, so let's go ahead and get started and get this ball rolling.